from the CyberHub bunker and studio. You're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast Tech Corner. And now, join me in welcoming your host and CISO, James Azar.
Well, folks, welcome to today's Tech Corner. Let's get this background situated. Here we are. That's more classy, more homey, light a fire, even though it's summer. And join me and Joseph Salazar today as we explore the world of endpoint security. Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, folks, before we get into today's show, though, a few housekeeping notes to keep in mind. If you have not subscribed, this is your first time tuning in because, well, you followed Joe and you heard Joe's on the show and you were like, I got to check out what Joe's talking about. Please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. The CyberHub podcast is a show I do every single day. We post new content. Monday through Thursday, we post the practitioner brief, a 10 to 15 minute insight into the risk, impact, and mitigation of the latest cybersecurity threats. And on Friday, I post these awesome segments with smart people like Joseph, so you can tune in and catch those daily and get all of your fix and all of the content right here on the CyberHub podcast. You can also check out our CISO Talk podcast and so many other shows that we do to help educate, entertain, and keep you informed. Without further ado, Joseph, welcome. How's it going? We're recording on a Monday, which means we're like, is it Friday yet?
Yeah, it was a long weekend. I pretty much work nonstop most of the weekend. Even though this weekend I had to host a birthday party and a graduation party, so it was a little rough. So this Monday has been. Oh, and I had a presentation this morning at 8:30 and a 7:30 meeting besides. So yeah, it's a typical Monday.
Yeah, it's a typical Monday. And is it Friday yet? Is the hashtag for today's episode, because this episode is published on Friday. So is it Friday? Yes, it is. All right. So Joseph, for the audience who doesn't know you and isn't familiar a little bit with you, talk a little bit about your background and how you got started in cyber and what you do today. Okay,
sure. So it's actually a very interesting story because I started working in IT out of high school, but it was like it was basically just to keep get a job while I was going through school, and while I was doing my college work, I ended up joining the Army. I enlisted in the Army and competed and got an ROTC scholarship. So I ended up going to Berkeley. So I was a graduate of UC Berkeley, class of '95. And I was a legal studies major. So when I was working in legal studies, I ended up moving to St. Louis for various personal reasons. And while I was there, I was working at a law firm trying to get some experience, and ended up, because I had a lot of experience doing IT, because personally, I built my own systems and I was a gamer and all that other stuff, I ended up doing their support. And so I ended up getting a call and, from a consulting firm, because one of the ladies who had left had mentioned me to them as a, that typical recruiting thing. Ended up working in IT for about a year, and then quickly shifted over into IT security and information security. And I never looked back. So I've been doing IT security for over 24 years now, I think. And while I'm doing that, I was in the Army. So in the Army, I was enlisted as a counterintelligence agent. And then when I graduated from Berkeley, I got a commission. I stayed in military intelligence for a good part of my career. And then the last 8 years, because I had, all of this civilian experience doing IT security, I ended up doing cybersecurity when I stood up the branch, and was last 8 years of my career was cybersecurity. And I ended up retiring as a major from the reserves about 5 years ago. So been working, and almost all of my work up until this job has been as a practitioner. So, for the government or the military, you're required to have a CISSP to do certain levels of jobs. So I got my CISSP when I first went on active duty. I'm also CEH version 5. So for those of you who understand, version 5 CEH was like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. I think they're at version 10 or 11 now, maybe 12. And I'm also an ENCE, which is an NK certified examiner. So I do computer forensics. So I've done pretty much everything from offensive and defensive security that you can think of. So I've done some pen testing, red teaming, computer forensics, network strategic defense, the whole 9 yards, both private and public sector. So pretty varied career, but I've enjoyed every minute of it.
So what are you doing today with Attivo Networks?
So Attivo is actually interesting because I joined the company. For those of you who don't know, Attivo started out in the deception space and has since expanded over into identity protection, but not identity protection the way you're thinking. But so I started as a they actually came when I was working at a e-commerce company. You know, a small e-commerce company you may have heard of called eBay, and they gave a presentation, and I ended up getting recruited, and the recruiting cycle took 8 days, and I was working at Attivo. Started out as an SE, and then as a sales engineer, and then ended up going into marketing because my unique background of military intelligence, where I've had a lot of experience with deception and counterintelligence, and cybersecurity practitioner background, sort of made me uniquely situated to message what Attivo does to both practitioners and non-practitioners, sort of translate the deception and security space to people who only ever thought of it as honeypots and honey tokens, which is it's much more expanded than that. So yeah, I'm a technical marketing manager for Attivo, and I do a lot of the technical work behind for the marketing team.
Yeah, so love that. Our topic and love it. So let's talk a little bit about our topic for today's show, endpoint. Endpoints have evolved. Who would have thunk it, right? 15, 16 months ago, if you and I would have done this show, let's say 18 months ago, if you and I would have done this show, and we talk about endpoints, we'd be talking about an office setting and network. And then
we're talking EDR, we're talking EPP, maybe some HIPs and HIDs, you know, and then COVID happened, and endpoint became completely different.
Yeah, endpoint kind of got revolutionized.
Yes.
Right. And endpoint changed, and also the way we as practitioners do security changed. Yes. Because the idea of a parameter, of a fence, of this invisible kind of office or building or network that we build around a specific address or location essentially dissipated one day. In one day, in a matter of one announcement, gone. And we had to rethink everything.
Well, the funny part about that is that if you think about it, the perimeter sort of started dissolving when people really started adopting cloud, right? So you had people that were already starting to do BYOD, and you had people who were already doing remote. So already at maybe, 10, 15 years ago, when VPN really started taking off, you had a perimeter that was sort of starting to get porous. And then when the cloud happened, when people started adopting the cloud, then it was a question of, is the cloud part of your perimeter? How do you make the cloud part of your, how do you make your security defenses, your perimeter security defenses part of the cloud infrastructure? How do you protect your data when it's not stored in your own system? Because the cloud is just somebody else's computer and data center. And then you have the push to remote work, where you had some people, I have friends who've been doing remote work for 10 years, right? And then as the talk about, hey, can we do remote work? Is it feasible? Is it possible? And then COVID hit, and all of a sudden it became mandatory, right? And so now, when you're talking about endpoint, you're talking about somebody's computer that you probably don't own, that you maybe can install some applications on, who's accessing data that's in the cloud using software as a service or infrastructure as a service, stuff that's out there that you don't technically control. You control the workloads and the data, you don't control the infrastructure, but you have to make that part of your enterprise network somehow. So yeah, endpoint has changed significantly.
So with endpoints changing, has security vendors kind of picked up to that change and adapted, or are we still dealing with the same old tools trying to deal with the new complexity of security?
So I'd say that there's a lot of vendors who have picked up on that, who have sort of started adopting. I mean, if you look at the new companies and a lot of the way the established players are pivoting, they're starting to really focus on securing cloud, securing that off-premises environment. The on-premises stuff is never going away. right? For companies that are well established and have established locations, that weren't born in the cloud, you're going to need firewalls. You're still going to need proxies. You're still going to need EPP, EDR, all the SIM, all of the what you consider traditional security tools. You're still going to need, right? That's not going to go away. But you're adding on top of that a security workload that's going to be focused on your cloud. And that security infrastructure needs to be adaptive, and it needs to be able to expand and contract as you need it, because, again, there is no more perimeter. As soon as you've gone to the cloud, your perimeter has disappeared. So yeah, I would say that a lot of vendors, a lot of offerings out there now are really focusing on that cloud-first security. We at Attivo sort of look at it a little bit differently. We really don't care where your network exists, because the one thing that you really need to focus on is the identity. And we're not talking about identity protection like, identity theft and things like that, where, they steal your credit card information or that kind of stuff. When I'm talking about identity, I'm talking about corporate identity, where how the network identifies and authorizes you and and provides you with certain entitlements and privileges. That's the identity we're talking about. And so for us, it doesn't matter whether you're on premises or in the cloud, whether you're working remote or anything like that. If you can protect the identity, you've got a much better chance of stopping an attacker from going through your network, right? Because attackers focus on stealing identities. You might think of them as just credentials, but in the cloud, an identity is something completely different. Privileges and permissions on an internal network are entitlements in the cloud. So if you can think of a way, if you can protect that core enterprise or corporate or network identity, you've got a much better chance of stopping the attacker, because if they can't steal or work with an accurate identity, you can limit the damage they can do. So, from an endpoint perspective, that means things like removing the stored credentials that an attacker can steal, or hiding them, right? Or if you're talking about the cloud, limiting the number of entitlements that you've assigned to a particular identity. Like in something like Azure, there's 3,000 to 4,000 different entitlements you can have. And imagine managing all of that for every single identity that you manage in a corporate environment. You're talking several hundreds of thousands of identities. So it gets very interesting. It gets very complex, but we feel at least that the best way to protect your enterprise now is to protect the people who are using it.
Right. We're kind of shifting from an endpoint of being the device to the endpoint being the human.
Yes.
Which I think was a flawed thinking originally in security, which was trying to protect a piece of technology rather than the human using it.
Yeah. Well, I think about it. All it takes is a careless click on an email.
So I'm not going to let you get away with that argument. No. It's not a careless click. So I love that, because every person who comes on the show will say that. They'll be like, James, all it takes is one person clicking on an email.
Well, realistically, it takes. There's a lot of different ways to get in. When I did close action penetration testing, my favorite was putting on a brown shirt and carrying a package in and saying I'm a messenger, and getting in that way. And you know how many? It's kind of funny. You know how many waiting rooms have open network jacks?
A bunch of them.
And all you need is the right equipment to drop in and bridge the network with a Wi-Fi access point.
So I will say that a little while ago when we did an in-person pen test where we had someone actually go on site, and we had them using a handheld device that they were having connection problems with, and they asked to use the Wi-Fi at the company, and the person at the front desk was just so kind as to give him access to the corporate network rather than the guest network.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, we see that it's not. I like to look at cyber attacks kind of like aviation accidents, which is it's not one single action that brings a plane down. It's a series of events.
Small ones. Yes, it's a bunch of different small ones. It's that chain.
Right. There's a chain of events that happens that brings about a cyber attack very similar to a plane, right? Turbulence doesn't bring a plane down. Bad turbulence with a bad reaction from the pilot, with a technological malfunction, with, being overworked or exhausted or, losing coordination. Well, that's a series of events. And that's typically how that stuff works. And so, when people always talk about the idea of, all it takes is one click, I'm just let's have an honest discussion into the fact that, yeah, one click is one action.
It's one click
not the whole
to
thing.
start that chain reaction, though. It's that one click that can start the chain reaction, right? Because it's never the single click, but it's the single click that leads to the exposed system, that leads to the stolen credential, that leads to the lateral movement, that leads to the access to Active Directory, that leads to domain dominance by the attacker, that leads to data compromise, right? It's that chain of events.
Or it leads to the launch of ransomware, which is now like the hottest thing on the market, right? Like ransomware is not a buzzword anymore. It's like, this is so cool. Let's all talk about ransomware, right? And the most interesting piece of ransomware I've seen recently is the Epsilon Red ransomware, which to me is a very complex piece of ransomware that kind of threatens almost our defense in depth model a little bit.
Well, so the really cool thing about it, because I actually did a lot of study on this, and the ransomware component of Epsilon Red is actually a very simple executable. But what it's done to make it, which is very novel, is it's offloaded a lot of the prep work to built-in security tools, to built-in commands within PowerShell. It's freaking amazing. It is amazing what they've done. I mean, they basically, the actual executable is so small in size, and the only thing it does is encrypt. That's the only thing it does. And the way it goes about it, the way it blocks and changes firewall rules, the way it stages the process, the way it stops all of the known process names for antivirus and EPP and EDR clients that are on the network, and then it preps the system for remote access, and then it spawns multiple copies of the executable, and each executable encrypts one file. And so it's taken the beehive concept, and brought it into the ransomware field, right? You've offloaded everything. It's something like 15 different small PowerShell scripts that are obfuscated, so that all you need is to bypass. It's just a few minutes to bypass whatever EPP or EDR is on the system until you can stop it. And then you deobfuscate the rest of the PowerShell scripts, run them. You're turning off all the ports except for like RDP and remote access, or some side of remote access. You're doing all of these things to stage out. You're deleting shadow copies. You're doing everything that you would normally embed in a piece of ransomware executable, and you've offloaded it to a PowerShell script. So your actual payload is a tenth of its regular size.
Yeah, it's one that I think is going to haunt a lot of practitioners. And I almost say that if you're an EDR company at this point, realize that these players have bought a license from you and are doing some stuff on your EDR, and you're not picking up on how people are using your license. And maybe it's time to take an internal come to Jesus moment and say, hey, all EDR players, let's all get together on a roundtable, our own little mini G7, right? And let's highlight how are these threat actors overcoming our defenses? What are some of the common, TTPs and IOCs they're using within licensing our software, that we can all say, all of this is very awkward. These are the players. And now we can go to the FBI, Secret Service, DOJ, and really, start identifying who these people are. Just saying.
The really interesting thing, though, is that if you look at what ransomware has become, and this is just like maybe the past year or two, it's not just a smash and grab anymore.
No.
Right? A lot of ransomware players are actually doing the things that a typical advanced attacker would do. They're doing reconnaissance, credential theft, privilege escalation, lateral movement, target identification, and data collection. And they're not encrypting everything they can touch. They're encrypting things like your Active Directory server. Would you pay, you're going to pay $200,000 to recover some endpoints that you can just, re-image and start over? Or you're going to pay 2.5 or, 10 million to recover your Active Directory that you've been working with for the past 20 years, that all the backup has been removed and the rest encrypted, so that you can at least get back up and running. I mean, it's much more strategic. It's much more targeted, and current ransomware players now are extremely targeted, and they know exactly what they're going to look for, and they behave exactly like regular advanced attackers, right? the tactics that, for example, APT or state-sponsored actors would use are the same ones that attackers are now using, right?
Yeah,
and I'm not surprised that Epsilon Red has succeeded as much as it has. It's because they've become very smart at what they're doing.
They're also being very. It's about target picking,
Yes.
right? And the one thing we've noticed with ransomware is pick your target. So dark side picked the wrong target. They're getting chased like, God knows what. They're on the run, right? They've been banned from everywhere. It's kind of like John Wick, John Wick, I think it was 2 when he shoots the guy, at the hotel. Was it John Wick 2 or 3 where he does that?
2. That was 2.
Right.
When he broke the rules at the Continental. That was number 2.
Right. He broke the rules at the Continental, shot, and then everyone went after him. He had a bounty on his head. Right. That's dark side. They broke the rules of the Continental. You don't go after critical infrastructure. You can go after hospitals. That's frowned upon. You're called scum, but okay, that's just do it, part of business, right? You can go after, logistics companies. And, I think with Colonial and JBS, you went after 2 things you don't mess with America on: oil and steak. That's about 2 things where I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. I don't care what kind of person you are.
Right?
You're like, you've raised the price of steaks and oil, right?
Well, I mean, was it last week they had that Fujifilm had their big breach and no one batted an eye, but Continental, everyone lost their head because it affected everything up and down the Eastern Seaboard. And I think it took them a week and a half to get back to get the backup, and the supply lines. I mean, the supply chain for gas still hasn't recovered. I mean, there's a reason that gas prices are still high.
But you know why they turned off the system? I mean, they didn't turn off the system because the system was compromised. They couldn't build for the oil to keep going through the pipeline, right? So I mean, to me, that was, when I saw the CEO kind of talk a little bit about this and all of that, and, it's your business, something, I don't want to get into the idea of discussing, whether you should or shouldn't pay ransom. I want to focus on kind of endpoint protection, but ransomware is a result of endpoint protection. And
it's a failure of endpoint protection. Yes.
Yeah. It's that failure of endpoint protection. And so we're seeing the rise of it, but we're also seeing the kind of the confusion among consumers. Mm-hmm. And so that confusion exists within even small MSPs, Joe, right? Like you talk to small MSPs and they're like, well, we use Norton antivirus. I don't know what the difference between antivirus and EDR is. And now there's XDR and there's RDR and MDR and SDR and NDR and YDR. And they'll have all kinds of, like, we're going to have 26 types of this stuff, ADR and BDR and CDR and, like DDR, because they're going to keep coming up with acronyms for this stuff. And I did a show last week with Kim Hakim on the Voice of America, where I talked about cyber vocabulary. And I was like, we're losing the cyber battle. But we want to charge a little bit more money. We've changed one thing, so we're going to name it something new. Gartner is going to come on board because we paid him money, right? And now here we are. And we're in this, and then we go, why isn't the business understanding security? Maybe because we're all speaking 7 different languages, so no one can understand it.
Oh, and there's actually a really good point to that, because Gartner sort of tries to define something, and then other analyst firms.
Joe, are you with me?
Yeah, I think I've lost your. Are you?
Joe?
Can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me? I think we had some network lag there. Anyways, it's very funny, as I was saying. It's very funny because the way, Gartner tries to define like a market segment and a new technology, and then other organizations, other analyst firms may not want to use the Gartnerism. And so, take for example, cloud infrastructure entitlement management. Now, other analyst firms aren't using KIM; they're using cloud permissions management. I mean, it's the same thing, but when you start talking past each other because you don't want to use the same terms, it gets kind of interesting. And what people consider XDR kind of depends on whether you're looking at the platform play or quote unquote open XDR, right? So there's all these different things, and XDR is that new kid on the block. It's sort of developed and sort of expanded, and now EDR has a network-based component. It's supposed to be the endpoint, but now it's like reverse of what SOAR and SIM were trying to do, right? So it's very interesting. It's the way endpoint protection has evolved. the problem is that they're still focusing on the wrong things. So EDR, EPP, XDR, all that stuff is still focusing on initial compromise. We already know that an attacker is going to get in. There are ways to evade. I mean, look at Epsilon Red. They're evading detection. They're evading that perimeter defense. They're evading that initial compromise defense, and they're, infecting the system. What do they do afterwards? They do all the things that a regular attacker is going to do: discovery, credential theft, privilege escalation, lateral movement, all the things that they're going to talk to Active Directory. They're going to probe ports, right? These are common tactics among all stage 2 attacks, right? Stage 1 is the infection. Stage 2 is the lateral movement, what you do afterwards. But all EDR, EPP, all of them still focus on stage 1. We already know attackers are going to get past stage 1, so why not focus on stage 2? Why not focus on all of those tactics that everyone is going to do as an advanced attacker, and look for those? It doesn't matter about
so again, you're asking me a question here: is why are we not focusing on stage 2? Well, I tell you, as a CISO, I'm very focused on stage 2, 3, and 4 because I realize stage 1 is going to get breached, right? I can put all the sensors in the ground to recognize when someone infringes within my property or territory, right? But at the same time, my reaction to that is going to be the whole difference. I'll give you another movie reference because I'm just a movie buff. Bad Boys 2, right? How'd they get the Cuban guy to turn off all the perimeter security alerts? They kept throwing iguanas and cats over the alarm and making all the motion sensors go crazy, right?
Yeah, they performed a brute force attack.
Yeah, they did. But it was a brute force attack, but they got stage 1. They got him to turn off his EDR system so that they can go in and buy time in the attack, right? So they do the same thing with ransomware, and everyone's so focused on that one aspect of recognition. People are forgetting to look at lateral movement, network integrity. I can tell you as a CISO, one of my best practices that I share on the show often is we actually look at our discrepancies within our network operations, and we look if there's an increase in activity that's out of norm for whatever reason, even if it's by 0.2%, and we want to look at it and realize, why is it there? Why do we have such an increase in network activity? Why is there all of a sudden more data flowing through the network? What's the action that's causing this movement? I like to go granular because that's where all this stuff happens, is on the granular. But people almost want this like James Bond type of mystique, right? Where something like they move laterally and you get an alarm that says, intruder, AD, go now, deploying countermeasures. That's not how security works today.
The interesting thing is from our perspective, we look at things a little bit differently. The interesting is that I can actually do that if you've got the right types of in-network threat detection. And again, I'm specifying in-network because just about every single piece of threat detection is externally facing. You got the right type of in-network threat detection, you can detect that lateral movement. You can detect when someone, for example, queries Active Directory from an unauthorized application with an authorized ID. You can do that. Again, that's that identity piece, right? If you can prevent an attacker from impersonating a legitimate user, you are more than halfway to stopping them, because they rely on being able to impersonate a legitimate user in order to do anything on your network.
Right.
You got at least doing some best practices to protect your credentials and Active Directory, right? If you're doing even just the bare minimum, just what you're supposed to do, you can do, and you can deny them a legitimate identity to impersonate. You're going to stop them before they can really do any damage, because again, they rely on that legitimate identity to do things on your network, right? Take a look at the SolarWinds, the Solarigate thing, right? There were so many instances of lateral movement and credential theft and things that you could have caught if you had the right they could have caught them if they had the right technology looking for those things. AD queries, the lateral movement, the credential theft, the accessing the SAML certificate. If they had the right things in place, they could have done that. But because it was such a low priority thing in terms of, they're not going to look. They don't think that an attacker is going to get to the point where they're going to patch the Orion system, the Orion software, and then have other people download it, which is really the novel, genius part of that attack, because everything else was common. It was typical. It was very well known tradecraft, right? The things that they did from an attack perspective, up to that point where they grabbed the sample, they stole the SAML signing keys and created an executable and inserted a malicious backdoor patch into the Orion software. They were all established, well-documented TTPs.
Right.
So if you look at the right techniques, right? If you're looking for techniques and not specifically signatures, you've got a better shot at detecting the attacker. And that's where I think endpoint, EDR solutions have sort of, they focused so much on trying to identify that pre-compromise signature or activity that there's not too much that they can do post-compromise. I mean, there's some EDR and XDR tools that can do some sort of investigation and identify some post-breach activity, but that's like relying on your SIM to let you know that an attack is underway. What a SIM tells you is something has already happened, and I finally figured out what it is based on correlation. That's like saying, by the way, there was just a car accident. It happened 10 minutes ago down the block from you, right? That's what a SIM does. Right. So
it's Google Maps rerouting you after you're 10 minutes into a traffic jam and there's no way around it.
After someone has reported that there's a traffic jam that they're stuck in. That's pretty much what it is, right? So rather than do that, why don't you look at the activities that an attacker is going to do, steal credentials, move laterally, discovery, etc., and focus on those, because those tactics never change. The tools they use might change. The malware signatures they use might change, but the tactics won't. The techniques might be different. Right, but the tactics won't change. It still falls under discovery, data collection, lateral movement, privilege escalation, all of that. It's all. I mean, if you look at MITRE's attack framework, those don't change. The simple, the individual tactics and the individual ways they may implement those tactics change. Techniques change, but the tactics don't. So look for the tactics, because you know that your regular users aren't going to be conducting port scans on an individual system. There's no reason for them to do that. Unless it's like specifically within their job description, there's no reason why somebody in finance is going to be probing an endpoint for an SSH server. There isn't one, right? So look for those tactics, look for those activities, and there are ways to do that.
There are ways to do that, but the challenge we have, and let's for a second focus on why we're not doing as much of that. Okay, there are several challenges with it. One is knowledge.
Yeah,
you know it, I know it. There's probably hundreds of other people who know it, but how many of them are actually? There's a big difference between knowing and doing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've had this discussion for the past 6, 7, 8 years. The gap, the skills gap within IT security. How many open recs are there now? The estimate is something like 2 to 3 million open.
Yeah, I don't buy it. I've seen those numbers. I don't buy it. I don't buy it.
But I think it's gotten to the point where I know that there are at least, based on my experiences, there are at least maybe 40 to 50 universities that actually have an information security program.
You want to know what the challenge is? I'll give it to you from something I saw this morning. Someone sent it to me. On LinkedIn, 6,750 some odd jobs that are entry-level cybersecurity jobs, all of them requiring a CISP.
Yep. Well, and that's the funny part, because I remember when the CISP first came out, and it was kind of hilarious because all the requirements were like, 5 to 10 years of security experience. Oh, and the CISSP. This is a new certification, and you're putting it on every requirement already, right? I mean, let's be honest. Not every entry-level information security job requires a CISP. Maybe a Network Plus and a Security Plus, right?
Maybe some require a CISP. Can we just say that? None of them require a CISP. There's no entry-level job that requires a CISP.
Absolutely. I completely agree 100%. The problem is that HR can only puts what they think, because they don't understand that ramp up, right? They don't understand that a Security Plus should get you in the door, and you can do level 1, level 2 analysis. To go beyond that, and that's all about experience. A CISP, realistically, high-level management, high-level administration, high-level, level 3, level 4, level 5 stuff that you don't necessarily need to sit on an IT security help desk chasing down tickets. You don't need that. But the problem is that because HR doesn't really understand that how the steps, and even the government, which does a pretty good job of sort of figuring out, hey, this certification for this type of job, even they kind of screw up still, right? I mean, when I was on active duty and I got my CISSP, which you're required to get your CISSP 90 days after showing up on active duty, and I did it in 60, just because I was already studying for it, and like, oh great, they'll pay for the test. But if you look at the requirements within the regulations for government jobs, a CISSP gets you admin level 1, 2, and 3, and technical level 2 and technical level 1, 2, 3, and admin level 2 and 3 jobs, which is enough to make you a director. A CISSP is enough to get you a director level position in the government. You don't need that to do help desk, answering phones, and running down tickets. You don't need that to be an analyst. As a matter of fact, I would argue you don't need a Security Plus to be an analyst. What you need is a good analytical mind and some experience with information security concepts. You can learn everything else, right? I was self-taught. I didn't go to a school. I'm sure you didn't. I mean, there were no schools for information security when we were doing it, right? There were none. It was all about learning by the seat of your pants and doing your own work, doing your own research, outside of your job where you're doing
the books. It's reading all the books that are behind me, all the books that are behind you.
Yep.
Going on YouTube and watching a video of someone doing something. It's going on Reddit.
As long as it wasn't Hacking 101.
Well, you know what? That's really funny. I don't think YouTube allows you to put on hacking videos anymore.
So Next Gen Hacker 101 was really hilarious. It's just, if you ever get a chance, look it up. It's Next Gen Hacking 101, and he was talking about traceroute, and how it's just really, really funny. If you get a chance, look it up. And some of our listeners probably get that reference. But it's funny because most of the things that you can do now, like if you can find a good Discord channel or a good Twitch channel where they do information security tutorials, that's the next wave of learning. Right? And then a lot of it really is sort of learning some way to code, learning how to look at network PCAPs, because those are skills that never go away. Learning some sort of forensics. You don't have to go through a formal forensic training, but at least learn how to look at computer data from a much deeper level than your typical, like Wireshark is a great network forensics tool, right? And you don't need something like Encase to do forensics on the endpoint. There's a lot of tools that you have that are open source, but at least explore these options and explore these tools and teach yourself, and you can be a great analyst. And then once you've got that experience and you understand how workflows work and how things connect, and you can start connecting what happens on the endpoint with what happens on the network, and then start correlating all that data and understand this is what the attacker did, and here's the flow of the attack, here's what it did at the endpoint, here's how it showed up on the network, and here's how it showed up on the other endpoint. Then you can become an analyst. And like I said, there's a lot of universities and four-year colleges now that have introduced and have curriculums for information security, but it's still not as widespread as we would like it to be.
No,
it's not. And I'm a big proponent of information security training. I've been preaching this for 10 years. Find ways to learn if you're really interested in information security, because the only way you can be good at it is by doing it. And the only way to do it, if no one's going to give you a shot, is to teach yourself.
Yeah.
Teach yourself so that you can teach somebody else. That's the best way to learn.
I couldn't have said it any better. With the time we have left on the show, we kind of want to talk a little bit about the Open XDR, kind of like this neutral platform almost that's really almost, I don't want to say it's the counter to an Epsilon Red, but maybe could serve as one, maybe?
So XDR, the way I've heard it explained in several different ways, the way I've heard it explained is that XDR is essentially EDR with a response component that also pulls in data from other data sources, meaning network security tools. And it does all that correlation and pushes it down. So there is a network component to XDR. A lot of the correlation is usually offloaded from the endpoint, but the decisions and activity and actions are done at the endpoint. So think of it as sort of an expanded, that's why it's called extended detection and response, right? Think of it as EDR that is sort of sits halfway between the network and the endpoint. You've got components from both coming together where you come up to a decision, then you action it using the things that you've got. Now, most typical XDR is platform play, meaning the same manufacturer handles your EDR, that handles your network stuff, that gives you your network data. It's all from the big players. Open XDR is meant to be that neutral sort of fabric where if you partner up with the right people and you're a member of this consortium, you can send data, right? So I don't have to be, let's just pick a vendor out in the space like McAfee. So McAfee has an XDR solution. I don't have to have deployed all McAfee solutions in my environment to run XDR. I just have to have the right components that have that partnership and integration that can speak to each other so that I can implement that XDR. And that's what Open XDR really is about. And to your point, it can in some way counter what Epsilon Red does, as long as it can still, as long as it finds those PowerShell scripts and it looks at the changes that are happening and it looks at that lateral movement. Yes, it can do that, and a lot of that is correlating, seeing these PowerShell scripts get downloaded, which is a network detection, getting downloaded to an endpoint. Seeing, based on the processes that are running, that PowerShell has spawned 5 or 6 different processes, or seeing that the scheduled task has added this Go-based red.exe application, and it's got its schedule and it's spawning multiple iterations of its process because each one is running one thread to encrypt one file, right? All of these little things but the issue there is you have to do a lot of tuning, right? You're having to do a lot of tuning to make sure that it doesn't impact regular production. And that's what we hear a lot, at least speaking to other people in the industry. What we hear a lot is, I would love to automate something, but I don't want to impact production, so I don't turn it on. So there's always that human switch that has to review the conclusion before saying, yes, I believe this enough that I'm going to activate it. I mean, I'm sure you've run into that, right?
Yeah.
What's the one thing IT tells you? No downtime. I don't care what you do, but no downtime.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the balance of trying to find a time where, you look at the stuff and when it least impacts the business and you kind of have to turn it on and run it and test it. And this also plays into the idea where people tell me no downtime. But if we don't have a testing environment that's essentially parallel to our live environment, if I don't have a blue and green environment or whatever colors they give them nowadays, everyone's giving it a different color now. Some people call it purple and red. I don't know what it is. People change colors all the time. But
I mean, how hard is it to set up a completely mirrored environment of your production network with the right amount of traffic and then run tests on it? I mean, how many times have you seen
the cost of that? There's a cost to it, and no one wants to take the burden of the cost. See, the idea is everyone agrees with the concept, but no one wants to pay for it.
No one wants to pay for it. I mean, think about.
We all agree healthcare is important, but no one wants to pay for it.
I mean, think about the how behind you are on a patch cycle, because you've got to do regression testing, right? How many organizations have you worked for where the average patch cycle delay was 90 days because they have to do all the testing before they can deploy it? You're 90 days from when that patch was supposed to have been deployed. You're that exposed for 90 extra days because you can't afford to have anything break, particularly the legacy stuff that you rely on. I mean, how many banks still run COBOL?
A lot,
right? They still run mainframe, right? You can't let any of that stuff go down. You can't. So they go through that extra testing and, trying to set up a mirror network, a parallel network that is just like your regular organizational network, just so you can run testing on it. That's hard to do. And it's expensive. I mean, there are probably ways to do it where that's not too super expensive, but it's still, you're going to have to manage 2 networks, right? And so it's always a choice between what's best for the company and what's best for security, and they're not the same thing.
No, well, I mean, and again, it's the cost aspect. I think most people would agree with you. If you sit in a room with a CTO, a CIO, a CISO, and you say, "Hey, we need a blue and green environment," they're all going to shake their heads and say, "We absolutely do."
Who's going to pay for it?
Okay, who's going to pay for it? Whose budget is it coming out of? Well, security says, I don't have enough money to do this. IT's like, don't get enough money to do this. We can't budget for it. And the CTO's like, don't look at me. And when they go to the CFO's like, well, split it. And no one wants to split it because, again, it impacts your budget. And again, that goes into the concept of why we see downtime when there's a ransomware attack. I mean, the number one way to beat a ransomware attack is to have a blue and green environment and have them isolated and separated.
Yeah.
You take down this network, that's fine. Boop, turn it on. Live, business continuity. Now let's deal with whatever data loss we have because it hasn't been backed across.
Yeah, and where that really works, right? So you can talk to a lot of the vendors that do the virtual environments, like Citrix has the VDI and all that. Right. I mean, and I've always been a big fan of giving the user access without having to worry about the endpoint, right? Give them a dumb terminal, because that virtual environment you can reset on a moment's notice.
Right.
Right. I've always been a big fan of that, but from a provisioning perspective, it becomes harder. There's probably easy ways now to manage all that, but it's still
because of the cloud. Because of the cloud, when we're looking at infrastructure as a service or SaaS or platforms as a service, we can do that now. Yeah. We can. It's really doable, and the cost of it is minuscule. It's a
because you're only paying for workload that you're using.
Yeah.
Right. You're not paying for a completely different system to a brand new hard bare metal system running 24/7. You're paying for the workload that you just happen to be using on somebody else's bare metal, data center system.
Right.
But I mean, you're not paying for power. You're not paying for maintenance. You're not paying for any of that. You're paying for the workload. That's it.
Yeah. It's to me, we live in a very, very fascinating time in security where I feel like one of the things that I liked about our conversation today, Joseph, is we're going outside of the traditional box of thinking about this stuff and really going into a place where we can really I don't want to say hype it up, but really build on it and build more and more on it, right? And so
I think a lot of it is that people need to be aware that there are other options in what they're used to using, right? It doesn't matter. I mean, you're not an on-premises network anymore. You haven't been probably for the past 5 years, ever since the cloud really took off, right? So you need to start looking at solutions, because there are plenty out there that really focus on very specific problems that they can solve. Like, how do you handle Active Directory security? Ask that of 100 Windows admins, and most of them will tell you patching and hardening systems. That's not security. Patching and hardening a system is just good maintenance. That's not security. Security is something different, and a lot of them will probably not have a really good idea of what is actually in their Active Directory, right? Or look at cloud, right? There's so many different security solutions that are out there now that just focus on the cloud, right? So you need to stop looking at I always got to have a firewall, and I always have to have this and that and the other thing, and you start looking at it as the capability. Like, we focus on identity. We're not saying we're a perimeter defense solution. We're saying we focus on identity, and there are different ways that you can protect identity. Right. So you need to sort of take a step back and look at what your problem is, not what your environment is, because all your current stuff is about environment, firewall, EDR.
So that requires a different kind of thinking within the decision-making process within security.
Yes.
And a lot of times that change of mindset that you're talking about goes counterproductive to all the spending and implementation and talent and workforce that you have in your team, right? And that shift requires a team coming together and being able to tell a CISO, we're focused on the wrong things. Or a CISO going to his team and saying, I've made a mistake for the last 6 months. We've been focusing on the wrong thing. We're going to refocus, reshift. We're going to start to do things differently. And that's a very hard pill to swallow.
It is, but if you think about, the military has this concept called the OODA loop, right?
Right.
Observe, orient, decide, act. And the thing is most people, when they think of an OODA loop, is they think of it as a one-time thing. It's a loop for a reason, because you're always reorienting, you're always reobserving, you're always redeciding, and you're always changing your actions based on the input from the previous iteration of the loop. And so a CISO that understands that should be able to look at his strategy and say, okay, I've reassessed, I've reoriented based on where I am, and now I need to adjust. and I need to decide how to adjust, and then I will act on that adjustment. And then I'm going to reorient myself and observe again and see where I am. And it's incremental changes. I don't like to think of it as a waterfall or an agile sort of model. I like to think of it as continuous improvement. And that's what you need to do, because even small improvements can make changes all down the line, right? And again, I don't like to think of it as a waterfall effect. I like to think of it as multiple streams that join and then converge and then diverge again. Agreed. Because that's really the best way to think of security, because every single little project, every single little strategy session, every single push toward a focus or three different foci, it's all supposed to be pushing that strategy, pushing the security forward every single small step. And so I think if we look at it from that OODA loop standpoint, where we're constantly reorienting and never just sitting on, hey, this is the project I chose for the year and this is the one I'm sticking with. Yes, you've allocated budget, but you can always reallocate. You can always readjust. It might be big muscle movements, but you should always be able to do that, because the only way to be secure in this new environment where the threats are so advanced is to be as agile as they are. And you can't do that if you're just pushing the same rock up the same hill.
Yeah, I'm gonna completely agree with that. You are on point there. So we are a bit over on today's show. So I want to thank you so much, Jospeh, for coming on the show and having this awesome insight with us. People, if you're watching this now, Jospeh, Carolyn, and myself did a webinar yesterday. You should check it out. The link is going to be below. You can still get access to it now. So make sure you go and you check that out as well. The webinar with Attivo talking about, securing the identity and the perimeter, in securing the endpoint and identity protection in a new world, especially talking about the Cloud Active Directory. So for all of you folks here, thank you so much for coming through. We really appreciate it. And for everyone else, thank you for watching. Stay tuned, and we'll be back with a lot more shortly.
Thank you for having me.
Take care, Jospeh.
Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. And get all the latest information at cyberhubpodcast.com.